the executive Playbook in proud association with Hennessy XO. Each drop is an odyssey.
With 20-odd years of experience in the complicated local media landscape, Kgaugelo Maphai is what you'd call a well-rounded media professional. From positions at large media owners, to strategic roles at marketing agencies, and even being the client himself. He has a deep knowledge and understanding of all sides of the coin. But beyond the earned tokens through years of experience, he also possesses a unique ability to bring people within organizations together, to cross cultural divides and to look at consumers as more than demographics and data, something that has been key to his business and personal success. Kgaugelo Maphai, such a pleasure to engage with you in conversation. I'm quite excited for this conversation because you play a very integral role within the world of media, communications, and have proven to leave a mark almost everywhere you go. So quite excited for this. But I think first things first, when we reflect on the current climate and the environment that we're in, it's difficult to ignore the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And how it certainly shook things up from a business point of view. So much so that you actually found an opportunity to establish a new organization in the depths of a pandemic. Maybe let's start there just to reflect on what the last 16 months has been like for you and the opportunities you've identified.
You know, for me, when I first went on my own, it was in 2009.
Yes.
Right in the middle of a global recession.
So you have a knack for these things, right? Bad timing is your thing.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. You know, I think this time around, I really saw an opportunity to perhaps look at the opportunity that the pandemic presented. And I think in particular for the continent, Africa has always kind of had to follow the first world and kind of Eurocentric way of doing things. And I think what the current situation created through the pandemic was force people to start thinking for themselves. You know, for the first time in our lives, no one had answers for anything.
Right.
You know, we were all in the same boat, whether you had money or you're the poorest person. You couldn't leave your country, you couldn't travel. The lockdown rules applied to everyone. So for the first time in our lives, as living people today, we all had to succumb to the same rules. And I think for me, that's when I really started thinking about the opportunity of venturing into a Pan-African group, because I think in a funny way, you know, while there's a sad part to the pandemic that there's been a whole lot of people who have lost loved ones, on the flip side, I think for the continent, there's a huge opportunity, especially one where young people have an opportunity to emerge, and young people to come up with solutions for African problems.
And let's contextualize that, right? Because for many people, they might be familiar with you from the media shop. And as you say, you moved into the world of entrepreneurship during the global financial crisis. And now with the most recent pandemic, this is where you've also established a new business looking at Matrix, right? But it almost seems as though you have always been that young person that has sought solutions. So why is it different now through looking at it from a different lens?
I've always been employed, and you know, in 2009, like I mentioned, you know, started our own business, which I ran till 2017, actually, when I joined the media shop. Because you know, it also happens when you work for yourself is you lose sense of what's happening in the real world, because you know, you kind of isolate yourself and you're driven really by the revenue and your performance as a business.
Yes.
You know, trying to stay afloat, but then you actually lose track of how far the industry is going, you know, and as such, the opportunity to join Media Shop came at an opportune time for me, purely because it allowed me to get back into a formal structure.
Well, let's stick with that for just a moment, because entrepreneurship, as we know, has often been glamorized, specifically within the South African context of things, where you need to have a lot of grit, be someone who is resilient and have a great sense of endurance, and then success comes naturally and easily, right? Or that's the perception, at least, that we're made to believe. But help us unpack that in terms of how you approach your view and your role in entrepreneurship. Are you someone who, I guess, comfortably dabbles between both being an employee and yet still having entrepreneurship endeavors?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. You know, I think the two can coexist. Entrepreneurship for me is sometimes it's a God-given talent. You know, it's something that's inherent in you. It speaks to self-belief. And those traits for me can exist in both environments, but you need to be in the right environment that allows you to be able to drive a business entrepreneurially.
Yes.
You know, so if we look at companies like, you know, let's look at Discovery, for instance. You know, you look at Adrian Go. I mean, you can see that, you know, he's an entrepreneur at heart, but he's working within, you know, a corporate environment. And I think in South Africa, you know, one needs to make a distinction whether you're a businessman or an entrepreneur.
Why?
Because I think sometimes that's where the difference is. You know, I think an entrepreneur is just someone who just has that intuition and almost has a sense of where the opportunities are without always using science to kind of substantiate that. Whereas, you know, if you're a businessman, sometimes, you know, you need to go and do a case study, you need someone to go and benchmark and to do a whole lot of research.
Yes.
And sometimes, you know, you find people who have both, you know, who are able to have that intuition and then kind of bring the science into it.
So would you say you have both characteristics there?
Look, I think I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I often succeed, you know, with people who bring the other elements that I don't have. And as such, you know, in all the business ventures I'm involved in, I always have business partners. Even within the Matrix group, you know, we've got an MD and I've got other directors in the business.
Yes.
And all the businesses we're involved in, we partner up with entrepreneurs that are running those businesses. So our whole philosophy around Matrix is to either invest or partner up with owner, run, and managed businesses. Because I also believe the era we're in now, we're moving more into businesses that want to do work with people. So people wanting to do work with other people.
For sure.
As opposed to businesses doing business with business.
And I think that's a unique element you bring up, because you've even previously stated it in conversations when you were still in your capacity as the MD of the media shop, where you focused on the fact that we're moving into a delta realm, this data age, where data is all the information that's required, but we need to remember to humanize the content to make sure that it's still relevant. Help us understand, and I guess what's your perspective on humans working with humans and prioritizing the change and the impact that you'd like to make in the lives of humans through the Matrix Group.
More than anything, this pandemic has made that even more real. I think what we've learned in the last few months is that human life and just our families and the people we care about are the most important thing. You know, it's not the material, it's not all these other things that society drives us to dream about the whole day. The pandemic has really kind of pushed us into a space where we've all kind of had to think about what's important in our lives, what's important to life. And that's the essence of the Matrix Group, you know, that if you don't understand people, data has no context, right? Because without people, there is no data.
We're well aware that the landscape of media globally and in South Africa specifically has been changing. The introduction of new media, social media that's come on board. Everyone who really wants to have a platform can establish their own platform. How does that shift the landscape in terms of how you view the role of agencies, media owners, and the commercial relationship that exists there? So I guess, is it business as usual, or have there been new tools of the trade that you've had to apply?
We need to remember that media is a reflection of society. Right? Because again, like in all things, without viewers or listeners or readers, there would be no media. What we've seen in the last sort of 16 months is that, you know, video is increasing because of the rollout of fiber and data. Even though it's still prohibitive, you know, more and more, especially younger people, you know, are kind of having to consume media on platforms like, not on from a linear point of view.
True. It's laptops,
so
it's
it's
cell phones,
laptops,
it's
the second
iPads.
screen, as we call it. You know,
Yes.
another shift is that people aren't necessarily consuming media at a time that a program broadcasts. Broadcasters used to determine the rate based on the audience they attract at a certain time. As that viewer behavior changes, it's going to be interesting to see how the broadcasters then monetize how and when people watch their content.
And doesn't that shake up everything, I guess the landscape in its entirety for all the other stakeholders then who might be involved, from the content creators to the commercial clients who want to come on board, to agencies as well who have to share and I guess find opportunities of merging elements of communication here?
Definitely. I mean, I think, for agencies, our jobs, especially media agencies, our jobs are going to become interesting, so it's really going to be around finding the content that your target market is connecting with, as opposed to a program that's driving a particular audience. Right? So I think that's where things are going to become a bit nuanced.
So it's almost a sense of community, right? It's not just
Yes.
individuals who are watching or consuming this content. They are a greater sense of community as a following.
100%. And I think radio does that very well. If you listen to a particular radio station, you feel like you're part of a family. And I think that's why radio continues to have such a high affinity with the listeners and so forth. But we're seeing that podcasts are growing, so again, people are not listening to an interview necessarily when it's been broadcast. They're listening to it at another time. So the media landscape, I think, is going to change, and it's going to change even faster as data becomes cheaper. Because at the moment, there's still a barrier to entry for a lot of people to consume content digitally. And because people are not going to the office, a lot of people would go to the office, use the Wi-Fi to download all the content and then watch it later. So now that everyone is at home, they're probably not doing as much as that. But I think as it gets cheaper and as more and more players come into the space outside of the mobile providers of data, I think it's going to really shift. And we're seeing it already, the likes of Universal, the Sonys, all the companies that used to produce content for broadcasters, they themselves are going to become platforms.
Precisely.
Right? So develop their own content and create their own communities. So we are moving into that world of communities. And that's why at the heart of this, if you don't understand people, your life is going to get even more complicated.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have to marry kind of genres with interests, with the people who are consuming certain kind of content, and then see where your brand fits in.
Yeah.
Whereas agencies typically start with the brand. So, you're briefed that this brand positioning is X, here's our target market, but that in itself might be flawed.
And this is quite interesting because I think it even ties to how you've built up the Matrix Group.
Yes. Prioritizing
people, understanding that you're building a sense of community, and almost, I guess, a greater sense and emphasis on empathetic leadership.
Yes.
And when it comes to that, so often women have been described to be more empathetic,
Yes.
to think of the full picture when it comes to people and their involvement within communities. And that speaks to the directors and the partners that you have with you at the Matrix Group.
Yes.
You've been very deliberate about making sure that you create a sense of gender parity, diversity, and equal participation for all genders.
Yes.
Tell us why every day is Women's Day at the Matrix Group for you.
I think having grown up in a family, both on my mom and dad's side, the dominant gender is women. So I've got more aunts than uncles, on both sides. I just find that a lot of women in our business bring the characteristics that we need. And I think in this evolving world we're in, even more so. It needs to be people before profit, and we often talk about it, but we don't do it, and I'm just glad that not just in Matrix, but in all the businesses that we're involved in, where we have women MDs who were running those businesses before we came in and have been running those businesses for 10, 20 years, right? Successfully so. But, having to endure kind of the normal prejudices of not being given a fair chance and so forth. And I just felt that we had an opportunity to do it right from the very beginning. But being women is part of it. The skills that they bring, the passion that they bring really adds. And that's why our payoff line is the sum of us.
Yes.
That we're not an island, that together playing to each other's strengths, we'll get to where we want to get to. And I think for me, it's just that, again, intuitive sense of understanding what people bring to the party and how, by harmonizing that energy, we all move faster to where we want to get to.
Inclusion and, of course, equal participation, as you said. I guess there's lessons that a lot more corporates in South Africa can learn from that in terms of how they actively participate in the gender agenda,
yes,
in trying to drive gender parity. There's something so interesting you mentioned earlier, Kgaugelo, which is the attachment to family, right? And you mentioned a few more aunts than uncles. But it's also quite clear that you've got siblings as well as parents who have shaped your world of thinking, shaped your drive for entrepreneurship for yourself as well as many of your other siblings. I'm quite intrigued, maybe if you can share some details with us as to how dinner table conversations or conversations with your dad, with your brother, might have influenced and rubbed off, I guess, the sense of entrepreneurship on each of you.
You know, the irony, right, is, I mean, my parents are both academics,
yes,
you know, and I think growing up, we had the privilege in the late 80s when my parents both, you know, had the opportunity to go and study overseas in 88, and we managed to make the trip with them.
That must have been a culture shock as well, right? From leaving a restrictive
80s.
South Africa to
Yes.
this whole new world that opened up.
Yes, I mean, look, it was, as you know, the 80s was probably the most difficult decade in our country. The tail end of that decade, we had the opportunity to live in the US, in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, where my mom was doing her master's and my dad was doing research for his PhD. And what had happened, though, in 1986, so 2 years before that, my younger sister was born, and she was born with cerebral palsy. Obviously, you know, that was new to us. In South Africa, there was something that, you know, South Africa didn't have the facilities to help families, particularly black families, with kids with those conditions. So that trip really helped us, I think, as a family. In a number of ways. I think on the one hand, just around my sister, it brought us, I think, a lot closer together to really understand her condition, and we're part of her programs. You know, the therapists would come to the house, but my mom would have to go to the library and then come back, and then my dad goes to the library. So we kind of, as a family, got through that together. And then in the early 90s, when things were starting to change in the country, my dad started to do a lot of consulting work, and that's kind of how he started moving into business. And then my mom continued with education. So the funny thing is, when we were in the US, the school ran a promotion where we had to sell biscuits to fundraise.
Okay.
And I sold the most biscuits in the school. And I realized, hey, there's something here. And I remember winning a Walkman and TDK cassette.
That's quite a big thing back then in the day.
Yeah, you know, and I think at that point, I kind of realized that I love selling. Selling is something that's inherent. I'll sell something that I believe in. So at home, funny enough, there was never any kind of talk around entrepreneurship. But I think as my parents evolved and the exposure that they gave us to, you know, one got exposed to so many things, and that opened our world up. I mean, being in the States then at that time was also just a privilege because, as I said, the US is very similar to South Africa, but it also just, for me, boosted a lot of my confidence, just being in a different country, but being able to get through it. And the family then went back in 95. So my parents with my younger brother and sister, at the time, they were in Stanford. And I think for my younger brother, there's a bug that bit there for him, you know, just being in Silicon Valley. And
because he works in a fintech company that is established with partners, right?
Yeah, so, you know, much later, when he went back to visit a friend, he then started looking at this whole payment space, and And that led to them, with a few of his friends, starting Yoko. My other brother as well, who comes after me, Komuto, is also an entrepreneur in his own right. They in manufacturing. My father as well has been involved in business as well, so remains an academic at heart, but has been involved in business, chairing boards. And then my mom as well is running her own consultancy as well in business coaching and personal development. So I think each one of, and then my sister obviously goes to a center,
yes.
Because
and still keeps the family together. I can imagine, given that the
everyone.
Relationship is there.
Yeah, she's we call her the angel. That we've got an angel. We're Catholics at home, so
beautiful.
We know that we've got someone who will never upset God. She's also played a big role in really keeping us grounded and humbled. We're very simple family. And I think for me, what's been inspiring is just seeing my parents, come from very humble beginnings and really using education to better their lives, to better their siblings' lives, and ultimately to better our lives. And I think that's given us a firm grounding to tackle this thing called life.
I must tell you, it's so beautiful to hear how passionately and calmly you speak about your family, because we can tell that they keep you rooted. Yes. They give you a sense of love and belonging, which is quite evident. And that makes me wonder how you define success, given that you work within the corporate space, you are entrepreneurial, you fundamentally do work on driving profit for your entities, but at the same time are very deliberate about prioritizing people within your life and your business. Yeah. How do you define success?
It's really around understanding your purpose. Right, understanding why you're here. There's a saying that says the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you know why.
Yes.
And I love that mantra. Even with religion, I've tried to simplify what religion actually tries to teach us. And I've just come up with kind of 3 points: that it's about self-love, loving others, and loving your God, whatever your God may be. And I find that across all religions, actually, that's what it is. So for me, success is really about just self-love and being self-actualized and fighting for the greater good. One of the things we are going to be doing very soon is launching formally our foundation around social cohesion.
Through the Matrix Group?
Yeah, so it's a separate project, but it's going to sit under the Matrix Group, right? Because what we want to do with the foundation is really see how we can drive a conversation for South Africans, because we believe that's what we've been deprived of. We've been brought up to stick to our own, and there's been a lot of fear created around that, right? But when you have a conversation with a stranger, more often than not, you actually realize not how much you have in common, but there's some elements that make you South African. But we never focus on that. We always kind of been forced to look at what makes us different, but also not celebrate diversity, right? The most successful countries in the world are the countries that have people from outside that country who have diverse views, and they come in to one pot, and that drives innovation and different solutions. Yeah. And different ways of looking at the world. And I think for us, because certainly what the apartheid system did for black people in particular is it entrenched us ethnically, geographically. So if you're Chivenda, you're up in the north, the chances of you interacting with a Xhosa-speaking person in your life are almost impossible.
Unless you move, right?
Unless you move and you meet in Joburg, or you have a common interest through work or sport or church or whatever it is. And yet the majority of our people therefore remain in their own provinces with the people who speak just that language, with the stereotypes they've been brought up on, and any kind of indoctrination. Yeah. So what we're trying to do with the foundation is to drive conversations that allow people to go beyond that, right? And for us to unlabel each other.
Is that the legacy you want to leave behind?
Yeah, man. Like for me, it's not about money. Like for me, it's about, if I can contribute to leaving this country in a better place for our kids and their kids, then I'll be successful.
Kgaugelo, such a pleasure engaging with you, and I think so refreshing to hear a very different perspective from business leaders who are prioritizing people, making a change, and of course evolving the societies that we actually live in. Wishing you all the best going forward with the Matrix Group.
Thank you so much, Gugu. Really appreciate you having on the show.
The Executive Playbook, in association with Hennessy XO, celebrating personal and business success.